Between the Covers is brought to you in part through the support of Propeller, a magazine of books, music, art, film, and life, and its publishing imprint, Propeller Books. Visit them on the web at propellermag.com and propellerbooks.com or on Twitter at propellermag. Hi, I'm David Naiman, the host of the radio show and podcast Between the Covers. People are often surprised to learn that this is not my day job, that I don't get paid. But that's not why I'm here today. I'm not here to ask you for an income. Up until now, hosting the podcast has involved only nominal fees, but the podcast has seen explosive growth this year. Listenership has quadrupled in less than 10 months, and these once nominal fees have grown to many hundreds of dollars, which could easily become thousands next year and which I'm paying myself. So I'm here today talking to you in the hope of creating a sustainable model for me to nurture the podcast's success. If you value these interviews, whether with great fiction writers such as George Saunders, Lori Moore, or Junot Diaz, science fiction icons Ursula K. Le Guin, William Gibson, and Neil Stephenson, or genre-bending essayists and poets such as Claudia Rankine, Maggie Nelson, and Mary Ruefle, I hope you'll become a patron of Between the Covers. Your per-episode contribution would be your way to participate in the show's long-term health. Please take a moment and either go to Patreon, patreon.com/betweenthecovers, or to davidnaiman.com/support. And give your support, and enjoy today's program. Good morning and welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's guest, Rob Spillman, is the editor and co-founder of Tin House Magazine, executive editor of Tin House Books, and co-founder of the Tin House Summer Writers Workshop. Tin House was the recipient of the 2015 Firecracker Award for General Excellence and has been honored frequently in Best American Stories, Best American Essays, Best American Poetry, O. Henry Prize Stories, and the Pushcart Prize Anthology. Rob Spillman himself was the 2015 recipient of the Penn Nora Magid Award for Editing, as well as the 2015 inaugural Vito Award from Vita Women in Literary Arts. And Rob Spillman's writing has appeared in Book Forum, the Boston Review, the New York Times Book Review, Rolling Stone, Spin, Sports Illustrated, Time, Vanity Fair, Vogue, among other magazines, newspapers, and essay collections. He writes the Read Politic column for Guernica magazine, is the editor of Gods and Soldiers, the Penguin anthology of contemporary African writing, and is on the board of the Community of Literary Magazines and Small Presses, the Brooklyn Book Festival Literary Council, Narrative 4, and is the chair of Penn's membership committee. But Rob Spillman is here today to talk about his first book, All Tomorrow's Parties, a memoir, 10 years in the making, which has received starred reviews from Booklist, Publishers Weekly, and Kirkus, and early praise from writing luminaries Anthony Doerr, Nick Flynn, and Rachel Kushner. Kirkus says All Tomorrow's Parties is a coming-of-age story couched in a travel narrative, one that deftly evokes one of the major historical moments of the 20th century, a richly detailed and always engaging memoir on artistic discovery. And Anthony Doerr adds that if you've ever been young, in love, and desperate to live an authentic life, this book is for you. A ravishing memoir about a young man's quest for art, meaning, and a place to call home. Welcome to Between the Covers, Rob Spillman.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a real honor to be here.
So All Tomorrow's Parties is composed of two intertwining narratives. Both, I think you could consider travel narratives in a sense, and both involve searching for identity, one taking place during your childhood and another as a young married adult. Let's start with your childhood, partly because growing up in Cold War Berlin with your dad kind of feels like a golden age that casts a shadow over a lot of the rest of the book. So tell us why your family was in Berlin and what it felt like.
My parents are classical musicians, and they went over there on Fulbright scholarships after going to music school. And at the time, and it's still this way, Germany is a much better place for beginning musicians, especially classical musicians. There are small opera house and music outlets all over Europe, and particularly in Germany. So it was a good place to launch their careers. And Berlin was particularly cheap because it was at the epicenter of the Cold War. And it was this cultural mecca at the same time because the post-war treaty, it made Berlin a neutral city. So that if you were a resident of Berlin and you were German, you didn't have to serve in the army. So a lot of liberal Germans moved there as well, and it was cheap. And so it created this sort of kind of artistic foment. So it was a really exciting place to be, even though it was 200 miles inside of communist territory.
That's a really weird thing to imagine, that island of liberal artistic expression there.
Yeah, it was a very weird mix of, there was a huge U.S. Army presence, but there was also all this kind of liberal craziness because there were these giant loft spaces that were very cheap, and expat musicians from all over the world, and artists, visual artists, were there as well. So,
can you speak a little bit about when your parents split and you're living with your dad, and what life was like with him in the opera, and you living in Berlin with your
my
dad?
Parents, I have no memories of my parents together. They split when I was very young, and my mother went back to the U.S., and I stayed with my father, who is gay. So I kind of grew up backstage in the gay opera world of Berlin, both backstage and on stage. I was in a lot of kids' roles as because I was around and I could sing, and I was available, and it was fun. It was fun. So I liken it to sort of being like Eloise in the Plaza, but if the Plaza was mostly gay and filled with like opera stars, and opera people. So it did not prepare me well for the rest of the world. But at the time, I thought it was really fabulous. I'm also an only child, so I had nothing to compare it to.
It felt like you were treated in a lot of ways like a young adult, even when you were a kid. Like you had a lot of freedom to be with adults in this art world, even from a young age.
Yeah, absolutely. And with that, I just had to behave. I had to be basically invisible or act like an adult.
Yeah.
So I didn't really particularly have a childhood.
I do love the scene in All Tomorrow's Parties when you go to East Berlin with your dad and you're smuggling currency over so that you can buy things at a better exchange rate.
Yeah, that was because they never searched kids. So, and you were forced to exchange your money one for one. But if you smuggled it in, you could then use it. And the East Germans loved Western currency.
One of the really early on scenes that adds a lot of narrative heft to your memoir is when your parents split, but then sort of inexplicably to you have to move to America to live with your mom. And it doesn't seem like you really grasped the why of that at the time. But you also realize really quickly that you can't speak the language of people your age, particularly American people your age.
Yeah.
And I would love for you to just touch on that a little bit, because it feels like in a way that Berlin becomes a sigil for you, like the sign you're not American, you're not German, and being a Berliner is actually something quite distinct.
Yeah. That's well put, because when I came to the U.S., I hadn't watched any U.S. TV, and that was kind of the lingua franca of my peers. And so I didn't know what Charlie's Angels was, or the Mod Squad, or I Love Lucy. So, or even Scooby-Doo cartoons. Like I had nothing, and so I didn't know what people were talking about.
Yeah. But you kind of had to know.
And I had to know because that's what people were talking about. So I started watching reruns obsessively. Like I would, whenever I could, I would watch reruns just to try to figure out what the hell people were talking about. And I just, it took me a while to get up to speed. And also I had to obsessively watch sports, because that was the other thing, people talked about. And I hadn't watched any baseball or football. I'd only watched soccer. So I was culturally illiterate, even though both my parents are American, and I didn't speak with any kind of accent. So I looked and, walked and talked like a normal American, but I didn't know what anybody was talking about.
Yeah. And it feels like Berlin becomes this really interesting metonym or symbol in the book, in the sense that you have you in America not feeling American, your parents on different continents. You have this divided city that you feel connected to that's also an island within a country.
Right.
Which it almost feels like you're that island here, there in America.
Absolutely. And it became, the older I got, the more I grasped onto it as my true home. And I am really a Berliner, even though it was myth making, I was, building it up. It was my search for home, and I put a lot of weight into Berlin.
So if we flash forward to the other thread of All Tomorrow's Parties, you're in your 20s, you're in New York with your wife, Alyssa Chappelle, and you have a pretty good life, it sounds like, going on, but here Berlin sort of disrupts it after you've been in America for a long time. So perhaps could you paint the picture of your life pre the siren call of Berlin, and then how that sort of unsettled what you were doing? Yeah,
I moved to New York with no idea how publishing works, but just sort of these sort of romantic notions of having read about the Beats and Patti Smith and all these people were living really large in New York, and that's what I wanted. And I lucked into a few things when I moved there. Mainly, I fell in love when I was 21 and got married when I was 23 and moved to the East Village. And because we were the only couple that anyone knew, we were kind of a center of a group of friends because we were literally the only couple. And when people moved to New York, they would sleep on our sofa. And since we were right in the center of the East Village, Sonic Youth, the band, lived right around the corner from us. And so we would run into them and say, hey, where are you playing tonight? And they'd be like, oh, CBGB. So, great, all right, we're there. And so we would see them all the time and all the other bands in the neighborhood. And so it was just like a very vibrant scene. But I also, I sort of chafed at it. I really didn't think, it felt dead to me. I felt I had these sort of mythic ideas that I would walk into the Cedar Tavern and get in a fist fight over aesthetics with Frank O'Hara. I just had this.
And that wasn't happening.
That wasn't happening. Yeah. That was a different era. And, I also had this, what I couldn't get my head around was all my heroes had created their own scenes. They hadn't walked into a scene and been adopted by it. They and their friends made the scene. So I kept putting this I kept having Berlin in the back of my head. And then when the wall came down, I thought this was a sign, a cosmic sign that I'm not meant to be in New York, but I actually really need to step into this void that is Berlin right after the wall came down.
And how was that negotiation in your marriage when you're like, okay, our life's going well, but it's just not, there's something, that I can't quite describe that's missing here?
Yeah, we were kind of young and foolish at the time, and Elisa trusted me, bless her, that things would be okay and that we could come back, that we weren't abandoning everything. But she'd made a real leap of faith, and for her, she had grown up with a very stable, loving family. The kind of the opposite of mine. She grew up in one place outside of Wilmington, Delaware, with incredibly great parents. I love her parents. They're fabulous people, and her sister is fabulous. I was always on edge around her family because I didn't understand what a normal nuclear family was at first. They were really, when's the shoe going to drop? But it never did. So she was actually open to adventure from a different perspective. Because she had so much stability, she was willing to go with it.
One of the really delightful things in the memoir, I think, is how you imagine what these other inspiring artists or writers did and use that as motivation yourself. And I wondered if that came from having a dad like your dad. How many writers, I don't know any other writers or editors who have a father who lived for their art, who would do everything based on that and based on passion, not based on what's best in terms of being secure with your finances or what's best and most reasonable or stable, which seems like that must have been a model for perhaps looking at these other models.
Absolutely. I mean, my father was he's still alive. He's still playing music. Sorry about that. He's still, very much living for his art. He just turned 80, and he's off to Texas to judge a piano competition.
Yeah.
But, as a young kid, it was really romantic to watch him just, age 40, sleeping on a futon and doing exactly what he wanted to do.
Yeah.
Like he didn't consider what he did work at all. And
right.
when he was teaching, 16-hour days, he loved it. He could just keep going, so that was definitely a model for me. And I think I also, my parents did not communicate after they divorced. They just sort of handed me back and forth. And they both, I think, sort of overcompensated for the other one, how they thought the other one was parenting. So my father was even more lenient than he thought he needed to be. And my mother was kind of more strict and rule-abiding than she needed to be, because they were imagining how the other one was parenting, basically. So,
well, before you read from All Tomorrow's Parties, maybe you can set up what Berlin was like when you went back. So here we're talking about the wall going down, but Germany is not unified yet. So it's this weird limbo period. What was that period like?
So, it was a very unique historical bubble, because when the wall came down in the fall of '89, what happened was that quickly the two countries agreed to unify, but it wasn't set until the fall of 1990. And the Western authorities didn't have authority to come over yet. So they couldn't police the east side. And in the east, a lot of the police had basically run away from their posts because they weren't being paid anymore, because the East German government had run out of money. So there was this power vacuum that was happening. And in that power vacuum, a lot of anarchists moved in and took over abandoned buildings and painted the buildings pink and flew anarchist flags out of them. And then skinheads would come in from the north, and these were a lot of laid-off factory workers, because the factories were shut down, and they would try to firebomb the skinheads. And so a lot of Westerners stayed away from this because it just wasn't safe. So Westerners stayed away, and also the large Turkish population of the West also didn't come in because in the West Berlin, there are Turkish kebab stands everywhere and things like that. None of that moved into the East until unification. So it was this very chaotic scene that we stepped into, and we joined the anarchists on this anarchist block, and had a really incredibly cheap apartment.
These strange, not really entrepreneurial moments, but moments where people are like creating wine bars or restaurants, or harvesting free furniture for their apartments out of burnt out buildings.
Yeah. And also these Germans, because they could go over to the West and buy really cheap furniture from the equivalent of like a Kmart, they would put their old beautiful furniture on the street.
Yeah.
Just to get rid of it, because it was like the sign of the old. And so we had...
Your apartment sounded amazing.
Amazing. We had Bauhaus furniture and, fainting couches. And, it was just all just dumped, like literally down the block from us. And it was crazy.
Well, could you read us a scene from that moment?
Yeah. Why don't I read right near the beginning, where... some kids have invited us to a rave, and we have no idea what a rave is, because it's 1990 and we're kind of clueless. And they take us to the sub-basement of an abandoned warehouse. So, was gibt's, I ask, and our guide snorts. He explains in German, which I quickly translate for Elisa, that we are in an old ball-bearing factory. He tells me this as he dances across long, sagging boards stretched between cinder block islands. Our flashlight beams ricochet off the oily water, which has a ferrous, noxious reek, and I picture my foot dissolving in it as if it were sulfuric acid. A faint, far-off beat, a fast, steady thump-thump-thump matches the pulse in my ears. Is there another room to the factory? I call after our guide, repeating the question in English for Elisa. No, no, he replies. The party isn't in here. This is only the passageway. Before I can begin to think about where we are heading, on the other side of the waterlogged basement, a 6-foot-wide hole opens into a dank tunnel. The thump, thump, thump of music is now clear, and up ahead a bright light pulls me forward. Entschuldigung, excuse me, my new friend says, shining his flashlight over my shoulder. I turn around and Elisa catches up to us. She gives me her, "What have you gotten me into?" look, and I give her my, "You agreed to this" look back. I also silently give her what I hope is reassurance, and I think she's on the same page, but I really don't care because we're obviously on the cusp of something weird and quite possibly wonderful. Where are we? I once more ask our guide, who snorts again and moves aside so that we can be the first to step through the hole and into a cavernous space constructed of gray granite blocks, the vaulted ceiling sweeping up a good 100 feet. People are dancing everywhere on piles of paving stones and railroad ties, and in the long trench that runs through the center of the giant space. They are dancing to the loud, steady, bass-heavy electronic music, something that sounds like Kraftwerk crossed with Donna Summer. The dancers cast huge shadows from the low, icy white strobe lights ringing the room. Atop a Lincoln log-like construction of scavenged railroad ties perched 2 sets of turntables and 2 young men with black bubble headphones who are bobbing along to the music. "Where are we?" I shout. "Under the wall," our guide yells. "This is an old subway station from before the war, closed off for 40 years. Now we break through and have a rave." I never want to leave, I say out loud. I think. I can't believe this. We are literally between countries, under 2 countries. I close my eyes and let the concussive bass vibrate through my body. I can feel the beat of my heart aligning with the beat of the music. I am dissolving, breaking into a million particles. I am nowhere. I am home.
You've been listening to Rob Spillman read from his memoir, All Tomorrow's Parties. That section's an interesting section because it touches on a recurring motif in the memoir also, where you've expressed a fear in the book around an inner emptiness, even once, I think, wondering whether you had a soul when you were a kid, that you weren't passionate about anything. And yet there was a flip side to that also, which felt like it was part of the same dynamic. But when you're partying under the wall, there's a blissfulness around the lack of location and the nothingness of the location. You could be anywhere, and also it's nowhere.
Right.
And similarly, there's a scene when you're in school in America, there's a hazing with a spanking gauntlet, and
right.
You escape and go dive into the ocean, and there's a sense of bliss sort of in self-obliteration.
Right.
So both a pleasure in that and also a sort of ongoing anxiety. Can you talk a little bit about that?
That was definitely a theme. I sought to either rebel or to escape, and my escapes were either through reading at first. I started working at a used bookstore in Baltimore, and that just sort of really fed my ability to escape. And that's where I became a real reader. And also through running. I became a long-distance runner in high school, and by college I was running 90 miles a week, and I would run into the mountains in Colorado and try to get lost and try to obliterate myself through that. And then also through punk music. I would, listen to incredibly loud, kind of violent music and go to hardcore shows in D.C. And it was sort of everything that I was not allowed to be in Baltimore. It was kind of...
and also really different than the opera world at the same time.
Yeah. And there was this dialectic going on of wanting to express myself and express my rage, but not feeling like I was able to. So these were my sort of places I channeled it.
Yeah.
And seeking oblivion or escape was what I was after.
And tell us a little bit about the structure of the chapters. You have, at the beginning of each chapter, you have a quote, and you also have a soundtrack song. Mm-hmm. How did that come about, and why did you choose those as the way to sort of orient us?
Well, a lot of the sort of anxiety of the book and my up until I was 25 was feeling, again, like what you said, was that I didn't have any of my own feelings, that I didn't have an authentic self, and I was living through others and through either books or music. And so the soundtrack and the opening quotes are kind of a way of kind of reinforcing that, and maybe also even a way of continuing to hide behind them and fighting against them, even as I'm writing the book.
Yeah,
you know,
I like them, and I love that. I saw that that Grove Atlantic made you a tour shirt.
Yeah,
for your tour.
Yes.
So you're doing your rock tour now.
Absolutely. I just sort of jokingly threw that out to the publicist, and they were like, "No, that's awesome."
Yeah.
They made me a tour T-shirt.
Yeah,
that's
pretty cool.
That's all I've ever wanted. Yeah.
And how did you arrive on the title and using that Velvet Underground song as the title?
Well, music is one of the main obsessions of the book, and one of my obsessions. And I love the Velvet Underground, and I thought that song in some way encapsulated the struggle of the book of living for tomorrow versus living for today.
Yeah.
And, that sort of sad recognition of that.
Right.
And, how that fact. So that's what I grasped onto.
Well, it was interesting looking at other interviews of you in the past. If we ignore the interviews in the last 2 weeks around this book,
Right.
almost all of them, close to all of them, are you as an editorial gatekeeper.
Right.
And we see the same sort of questions come back over and over again. What sort of stories do you look for? What are common mistakes that writers make? A focus on the art and
Right.
the object and the creative act and publishing. But here we are, now you on the other side.
Yeah.
And this book took you 10 years to write,
Yeah.
which made me wonder, as a writer, what sort of craft challenges you came across that you had to grapple with in finding this book's form.
Yeah, a lot. A lot. One of the problems of working in publishing and being an editor is I know too much. I know I'm a pretty good self-editor and know what works and what is not working. And so the first 7 years of working on this book, I was trying to write it linear and chronologically, and there was just no energy to it. I felt like there was just something wrong. And it was productive failure in a way, in that I was interrogating myself and my feelings, which is what I was trying to do. But I think I rounded a corner at some point where I really didn't care if it was going to get published or not. And I think that was a breakthrough for me, is that working in publishing, you're constantly surrounded by the noise of publishing and books that are coming out, and you can lose sight in the art of things, and that it became much more personal for me, and that I really wanted to interrogate my own feelings about the time and my obsession with Berlin and my obsession of living an authentic life. Those became much more important to me. And so the last 3 years, when I settled on the form of the struggle for me was to put Berlin more forward, especially the present tense, 1990 chapters. I wanted them more forward, and I could never figure them out. And then I sort of landed on this alternating form, and shifted those scenes into the present tense, which created more energy. And then I found when I was alternating that I was able to mess with time in a way, because I could refer chapter to chapter to things that hadn't even happened yet, or comment on them before they happened, and make allusions to them, which I hadn't even thought about.
Well, when we had Lacey M. Johnson on, she talked about writing against chronology because it mimics the way our memory works too.
Right.
So if you're not writing in the present moment, even if you're using the present tense, it allows that sort of mind movement.
Right. Which is absolutely. And as much as I know as an editor, I couldn't learn unless I actually did it.
Right.
That's what it came down to. And then, even then, I loved being edited. I had the greatest time being edited, actually. It was just such an honor and pleasure to have someone take your work seriously.
Yeah.
And especially for personal material, it's really hard for you to figure out what is important and not important. And a big breakthrough for me came when I read Vivian Gornick's The Situation in the Story.
That is really weird because that's my next question.
Really, that was
I swear to God.
Really, that was a pivotal book for me because I was just, one of the challenges of memoir is that the goalposts are constantly moving. You wake up every day, you're a different person, you have more knowledge, and you can just keep bringing in more knowledge. And her kind of genius, and the simple genius, is like you just have to separate, your situation and use fictive tools and also create a persona.
Right.
Even if the persona is you, but it's you at where are you fixing the persona? And so for me, it was age 25 and not letting in knowledge after that. And
well, I'll just read my next question just for fun.
Just so you can
But even though I kind of think you already answered it, but I was going to say that coincidentally, I've been reading that book, The Situation in the Story, and she'd mentioned one incident of someone who took a long time to write their memoir, and that it wasn't because they didn't know what they wanted to write about, but it was because they hadn't created the persona, which is both you and not you at the same time, but also sort of hones in the path of inquiry, and everything shapes around a specific act of discovery for that persona.
Yes, and that was absolutely.
I love that book.
That was a light bulb that went off when I read her because she's so simple about it's so simple and clear her articulation of that problem.
But it's like you read it and you're like, of course.
Yeah.
But it's not that simple at the same time.
And also she uses her own work as to illustrate it is also like I failed with my first book, but I succeeded in my second.
Right, the book about Egypt where she couldn't find the right voice.
Yeah. And also, what was interesting to me too once I did that was like I was able to winnow away an awful lot. And metaphor I use is that your narrative has to be like a taut string. Everything has to contribute to the tautness of the string going through your book. If it doesn't contribute to the themes of the book, it unfortunately has to go away.
Right.
Or if it happens after your, fixed self.
In case you just tuned in, we're talking to Rob Spillman about his memoir, All Tomorrow's Parties. Tell us about Coffee and Absinthe, the book that you were working on as a young adult. That never came to be, but was your project at some point and for a while.
Yeah, it was my way of, I guess it was like apprentice writing, and it was a way to also channel all of my my split personality in a way, my sort of dreamy escapist side, art for art's sake side, which was Absinthe, and then my sort of overdrive, hyper engaged, revolutionary side, which was Coffee. And it was a novel that was embodied by the spirits of Coffee and Absinthe. So,
and have you looked at it?
I haven't looked at it in like 30 years. I'm really afraid to. I'm really.
But it still exists.
It's somewhere. Yeah, it's in a box
it's
somewhere.
Not in the fire.
No. I wouldn't throw it out because I'm really curious to see how cringeworthy it is.
Yeah. What's one of the pressures for the book that I think is really great from the reader perspective is both you and your wife are really dedicated to live the life of artists. But throughout the book, Elisa's, regardless of what adventure you are on, she's in the background, working hardcore. Mm-hmm. And so she's doing all these adventures, but she's doing it. And there's this background pressure because you're not, and you're doing this sort of internal struggle, wanting to be doing what she's doing, but unable to be. Yeah. And with that in the background and you in the foreground, it feels like this coiled spring that's
yeah. It was funny because I talked a big game at the time. We're going to go live a revolutionary life and be artists and really do it. And she was actually doing it while I was parading around. I love the Faulkner quote of "Don't be a writer, be writing." And I was a writer, and she was actually writing.
Right. Well, and she's a formidable writer and editor in her own right. She co-founded Tin House. She was senior editor at the Paris Review. She's contributing editor at Vanity Fair, has written several critically acclaimed books. I was curious about her in real life outside of the book with all these skills, but also she's this character.
Right.
And while I think in the end it feels like the book is a love letter to your wife, in any given moment, Rob Spillman, the persona, has varying feelings about what's going on. So I was curious about whether you sought her input, or because of her being, editor, writer, and character, if you had to shield this from her, because that would just kill the whole deal.
That's a good question. No, we show each other all of our work, and when I first showed it to her, she said, "Who is this incredibly boring, flat, lifeless character?
Really?
That is supposed to be Elisa?" And I was like, "Oh," and I was trying to shield her in the writing, and she was like, "This is just dead on arrival." Like I would never say any of this, and she got in there and just hacked it up, and I'm like, okay. So she gave me the permission to actually, write it as it was. But she kept pushing. She pushed me the entire time.
So that wasn't fraught.
It was definitely fraught.
It was fraught
because she can criticize me like no other person. Right. I mean, we've been married 27 years, so so she up until I signed off on final pages in January. She was like, "This is a lazy phrase," or "This is
So she was an editor.
Oh yeah,
one of the editors.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, because she's very protective, and it's really easy to write the negative reviews for both of us. Why didn't this editor edit himself? We're both thinking that. So she's more protective than anyone. Yeah.
Well, you do a lot of danger seeking in the memoir, and there's a lot of politically volatile situations, but also the car crashes and a variety of other things that happen in the book. But when you were interviewed by Penn and they asked you what's the most daring thing you've written, you said this memoir. And part of that was around, I think, writing about people you love and people close to you, and that it was intense to show this to your parents, for instance. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I speak in public all the time. I do festivals all the time, but I'm usually out there promoting other people's work. I'm not usually talking about my own work. And this is, just really, it's exposing, so, and that's just not how I usually am, so it was hard to, and also hard to be honest, and it's just not a family thing. So it was difficult. And then very difficult showing my parents. I was very worried about how they would react. And my father came back first, and he said, "Oh wow, you made art out of your experience. That's great."
Wow, that must have felt great.
Yeah, it was, and he had some corrections and some fact checking things, and so I'm like, "Did I really do that?" And I'm like, "Yeah, Dad, you really did that." And then my mother, on the other hand, really disliked the book, and as soon as she was done reading it, she still lives in Baltimore, got on a train, came to New York, and sat down at my kitchen table with the manuscript and went over it with me for 5 straight hours.
Wow.
And what she didn't like, and what was a surprise to her, and what it was
that's fun stuff.
Yeah, it was. So I'm ready for the worst review humanly possible. I've been through it.
You've been through it.
I've been through the worst review possible.
Well, this is like a really alive question for anyone writing memoir, right? I mean, and I don't think anyone has the same answer. But do you have a guiding principle when you're writing your own story, but it's also the characterization of other people's lives?
Yeah, I was lucky in that I working with writers like Lacey Johnson and Nick Flynn or Dorothy Allison, they're very good. They've been through it, so they're able to give me advice.
Right.
Dorothy Allison actually had a really great piece of advice: is that you have to be able to sit in a room with the people you're writing about. So I thought she meant that metaphorically, and then it came to pass.
You really did sit with them.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
I'm actually going to go see her tomorrow in San Francisco. So I'll be able to tell her, like, I didn't think you meant that, like, literally. But yeah, I thought that was good advice, and also I really wanted to be, part of the reason it took me so long to write this book is like, it was an exercise in empathy for me too. It's like, I really wanted to understand what it was like for my parents at that time. And I think having kids of my own really helped that too. Being 6,000 miles from, any family, and then suddenly you're divorced and, financially dependent on the person you're divorced from. It must have been,
Yeah. And you mentioned the Vivian Gornick book. Were there any actual memoirs that were inspirations, or like ghost memoirs that you feel like you were in conversation with at all?
Yeah, the main one is Stop Time by Frank Conroy from '68. It's kind of a throwback. As it starts in action when he's much older, and it's just sort of this violent action, and it's just a one-page prologue, and then it flips to his childhood, and you spend 300 pages trying to figure out why that prologue.
Wow.
And it was kind of amazing. And also it's just beautifully written, and there's no hyperbole to it. I thought that was great, because there have been all these, the running with scissors model of, extreme woe is me. There's no woe is me, even though he had a really messed up childhood.
Yeah. There's definitely not woe is me in All Tomorrow's Parties either. Yeah. Another motif is which I think is going back to Berlin, when you think of like Berlin being this artistic hotbed, but also this politically unique scenario, that you're always looking for the nexus of those two, of art and politics. And you see that in your other pursuits, like the Read Politic column for Guernica, with your work at Penn, with the contemporary African writers, with your work at Vita. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about that? What draws you to that specific nexus?
Yeah, I think it's basically to use my privilege and power for good. I'm very lucky that I've risen to a certain position. And even when I didn't have power, I was always trying to figure out a way to affect change, not just write for writing's sake, and I was always trying to figure out how to get my agenda in front of as many people as possible. Sort of like early on, when I was freelance writing before I started Tin House, I figured out how to get Leonard Peltier into Vogue magazine. And I did that by writing about Robert Redford financing a documentary about Leonard Peltier. So I went to Vogue and I said, Robert Redford, comma, Leonard Peltier. And so they sent a crew to shoot Redford at his ranch, out in Idaho. And I wrote 2,000 words about Leonard Peltier. So I've always had that impulse of like trying to get my own, agenda through.
It's also cool how, with the Vita count, and for people who don't know what that is, the sort of the tallying of bylines for different publications and by gender, and now also by people of color and other metrics. When those counts came out several years ago, Tin House didn't only respond, but sort of went an extra level of response. Mm-hmm. And could you talk a little bit about that in terms of how you looked at the whole manner of how to choose, and then in terms of like the disparity even around submissions too?
Yeah, we actually did really well, relatively speaking, in the first count, but we were still had a gender imbalance, and we were all shocked by that, and so we sort of dug into the submission numbers and our rejection numbers, and we found that there were just sort of deep systemic issues, and things like when I reject a female writer and ask for more work, she's half as likely to resubmit as a male writer. Male writers are almost 100% will resubmit, and women only 50%. So I sort of had to double up my efforts with women that I actually really did want to submit,
Right. And wasn't there also an issue that even if you got a woman writer, say for the Lost and Found column about old books, that often the men would be the ones who were getting reviewed by the woman writer?
Yeah. So the Lost and Found column is you can write about any underappreciated or out-of-print book. And we were soliciting equal numbers of men and women to write about it, but both were picking 80% men. So that's partly historical. If you're talking about out-of-print books, you're drawing from a pool, but it's your chance to champion, underappreciated women writers if you're a woman or even if you're a man. So now we specifically ask, are there any women that, or, now we're actually doing this specifically for people of color.
Yeah.
Or LGBT voices. Like, are there, kind of lost voices out there or pioneer voices that should be brought back?
Yeah. So. I wanted to ask you also about the origins of Tin House's bi-coastal nature, because reading this memoir, I read all of the symbolism into that. Right. You come from a divided city. Yeah. You've created a divided magazine, but also, like, I think about the tension that you describe in the book between Ken Kesey and Hunter S. Thompson.
Right.
And you're also living some of your life like out in the mountains in Colorado and some of it in New York. And is that all fertile ground for how you came up with a magazine that straddles both coasts?
Wow, that's
or am I just reaching?
No, that's really good. That's really good. It wasn't actually. The intentionality was that our publisher, Wynn McCormick, was based mainly here in Portland, and he wanted to start a magazine here in Portland. And I loved the idea, but at the time when we agreed to start the magazine in '98, New York was still sort of the epicenter of literary culture. I mean, it's less so now. I mean, it's a little more divided, it's spread out. But at the time, there were very few agents outside of there, and there was just, I thought there needed to still be a big presence there. So I argued from the start that it should be bi-coastal, that I would stay in New York, but I would come back and forth, because I loved the energy and the no BS of Portland, but I thought we still needed the sort of, the professional, whatever. But right from the start, there was a kind of great energetic split that I loved, because I would bring something that would, one of the New York editors would bring something that was hyped to the Portland people, and they'd be like, yeah, and... it's just like there was a totally different orientation. Yeah, there was like, I don't care, whatever. Yeah. So there was a little more wide-eyedness and skepticism of things that were hyped, in the literary world.
So now that you're experiencing being on the other side of all of this, you're on book tour, 30 events in 30 days. You're talking about, in a way that's more vulnerable, about specifics of your actual personal life. And your work has been received by both your dad and the critics as that you have created art out of your life. Does this inspire you to do another book?
Eventually. Eventually. I think it would be very, very different. I mean, I could see writing about my experiences with Tin House and all the writers I've worked with. I mean, that kind of thing down the line, doing that. But right now, this still feels a little fresh. I'm still trying to figure it out. So, it's a little bit of a shock to actually see it, It's like, wait, it's a thing, So I think when I have a little more distance on it, I'll be able to go back.
What projects are on the horizon for you at the moment?
Well, I'm very involved in, as you said in the introduction, in various nonprofits, and particularly Narrative 4 these days, which is a story exchange organization that works with mainly teenagers and putting kids together to exchange stories. And I was recently in Palestine and Israel, and we're having our annual summit in Ireland in 2 months. So that's kind of occupying a lot of my mental spaces, doing those kind of things, as well as Tin House.
Right.
Tin House is still, I love my job. I get paid to read for a living. It's ridiculous.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's crazy. And there's still, every issue I get surprised and excited by something. So if I'm not surprised and excited by something or proven wrong, that's why I keep doing the job, is I love to be proven wrong. I love to see something that, oh, you can do that? Like, that's, like a Maggie Nelson comes along and you're like,
right. It's like,
what
wow.
the hell is this? I have no idea what it is, but whatever she's doing, it's working.
Yeah.
Or you see like a Mary Rueful poem and you're just like, I have no idea how she's making these leaps, and I really don't care because it's awesome,
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, it was a delight to have you on the show and also to read All Tomorrow's Parties.
Hey, thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. We're talking today to Rob Spillman, co-founder of Tin House and the author of the memoir All Tomorrow's Parties. You've been listening to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's program was recorded at the studios of KBOO, volunteer-powered, non-commercial, listener-sponsored, full-strength community radio from Portland, Oregon, found at kboo.fm. If you enjoyed today's program, consider supporting the show by going to patreon.com/betweenthecovers. And also while you're there, check out the growing archive of bonus material available. Thanks for listening.